Awesome. Hello, how are you, Daniel? How are you today morning?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Afternoon, actually. Awesome. Thank you for doing this for me and doing this for us as T Connection. Just before we get in, I think I'm going to do a small intro of what this podcast is about and who are we and who is Daniel. I think most of you might know Daniel. It's more about us, who we are. So, T Connection is a little initiative that we have started. So, my name is Aditi Shirali. I'm a psychologist practicing here in Adelaide, Australia. And the whole idea is to the T connection is thought, emotion, action, and tea. I think Daniel also has a cup of tea today. So it's having a discussion about mental health, anything related to mental health over a cup of tea and trying to normalize it to that extent so that people are not feeling judgmental or stressed or um, anxious to talk about how they feel. That's the umbrella understanding of T connection, and it is to connect more and more experts from different fields across the globe under one roof. So that's a little attempt from our end, and we've just started this process. This is our second Zoom podcast which we're doing. Today's podcast is with Daniel Angus. He is a psychologist practicing in Western Sydney in the mental health sector since 2006. He's a clinical supervisor, trainer, and speaker on the topic of well-being, adolescent mental health, and transcultural mental health. Daniel has worked with young people and families in the adolescent mental health sector, most recently in private practice, with other great organizations like Canteen Australia, Headspace Services in Western Sydney. And right now, he is the Deputy Commissioner of the NSW Mental Health Commission. Um, the connection that I have with Daniel is he has was my supervisor when I was getting my registration here in Australia after I moved here from Mumbai, and I think I wouldn't have asked for a better supervisor. I was really thrilled and excited. Being a new immigrant, I think a lot of people, a lot of my people who are listening will connect. It was very confusing. Felt lost. Even having that experience, still felt lost. And I think Daniel has been that guiding light for me. And I don't know about him, but I'm not letting him go. And I'm going to constantly be in touch for years to come. Thank you, Daniel, for really agreeing to do this and to be a part of this little podcast and sharing your expertise. So I think to begin with, just I think the first thing that we're going to start off with just understanding you've done a lot of work with teenagers and adolescents. Like, how has it been? Why did you choose that particular cohort? What was your idea behind it or your inclination behind it?
Well, thank you very much, Aditi. I mean, they're very kind words, and I'm always in your corner, and I'm so glad to be able to support you in this initiative. To answer your question, well, why young people? Well, firstly, I just really enjoy the work with young people, but a lot of people might know that about 75%, 80% of mental health problems uh, start between the ages of 12 and 25 in particular. And it's during this period where there are a huge amount of transitions, first time stuff. You know, people are going through puberty, transitioning from lower or primary school settings into high school settings. They might be increasing in their risk taking behavior. They might be trying things for the first time. And all of these things often result in stressors. And so if you have somebody who might be predisposed or might have other vulnerabilities, then this is a period in which we see many different kinds of mental health problems starting to emerge. And so my sense is that if we do really great work in this space, that we might see very substantial improvements to mental health and well-being for young people, but also as they transition into young adults and older adults, that we might see less of a mental health burden on our community, if that's a fair way of saying it. I think that we see huge amounts of money being invested into mental health services all around the world, but in particular in Australia every year. And I think that if we can start to um, get better at providing support to young people when needed, I can see that the burden for mental health costs later in life potentially start to go down. Well, anyway, that's why I enjoy it. That's why
Yeah.
I'm interested. I suppose the other part of it is that I tend to have a lot more fun.
Mm-hmm.
And there is something interesting, I think, in the notion of play in therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, although I would not say for every person, because I see adults as well, I see
Yeah.
adults up into 60, 70 years of age, but also many young people in my practice. But I do believe that sometimes as you get older, that many adults seem to forget to play and forget to have a bit more fun and lean into the spirit of creativity in our work. And I think that many of the young people that I've come to meet along the way have certainly been more open to leaning into
Mm-hmm.
creative approaches, uh, maybe leaning into play a little bit more. And that's why I enjoy it. Did I answer your question,
Yeah,
Didi?
yeah, 100%, 100%. I always tell you, right? I get caught up when you're telling things because they just make so much sense, and it's simplicity again. I think what I also feel that the simplicity in the way you explain concepts is amazing. It's interesting that you talk about play because I also do cater to that age group. I've always been since I started somehow, I think. And I'm also same. I enjoy it. I enjoy that conversations with the teenagers, and I always feel, human is we are like those Play-Doh, the softer it is, the easier to mold, and the harder it gets is difficult to crack. And so at that age, definitely, I totally agree. When do you say play, what exactly do you mean? Like, what kind of approach do you normally have
Oh,
with
well,
teenage?
yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I don't just mean, although it can mean that, getting on the floor and playing and engaging in a play therapy more formally. I mean that sometimes I think that there is a book that was contributed by some narrative therapy colleagues of mine around the management of serious problems in playful ways, and I think that a lot of people, a lot of young people are going to bring to their sessions very serious problems,
Mm,
very significant things that have happened to them in their lives. And
yeah.
I think that, if you consider why play might exist for people,
Mm,
whether it is to practice or prepare oneself for future occasions. And so you might role play, for example, playing with dolls or cars or
mm,
dinosaurs or whatever it might be. Well, then it allows you to, take examples from the real world and have fun playing with them with your peers, right? Uh, and I think what I mean by that is being able to externalize internally very serious problems that we become very taken by, impacted by, and move them out of the body and allow ourselves to tangibly play with them in some way. You know,
yeah.
work with them, role play them, kind of manipulate them in different ways, perhaps. Think about them differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. For example, if I say, if a 15-year-old presents with peer pressure and anxiety, especially in
Mm,
terms of the year 8, year 9, I see a lot of presentations at time because I feel like till year 7, like you said, it's still the primary or the middle school, and they're still, but when they
mm,
get into year 8, 9, the expectations academically are also increasing, and there's a lot of changes happening in terms of puberty. So if say a 15-year-old female presents to you in terms of some kind of peer pressure, comparison, body image issues,
mm.
how would you creatively help a client like that? Like, is there a way that you would do it differently, or what is your approach normally?
Well, I mean, perhaps and I'll get there a longer way,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe, but I remember doing a program when I first started at Headspace collaboratively with young people, and it
Mm-hmm.
was the Pet Space program.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a lot of people don't know, but there in New South Wales, there's an admissions unit run by the RSPCA in Southwest Sydney
Mm.
for self-harming parrots, parrots who pluck their feathers.
Wow.
And the thing is, parrots can live to 100 human years. You
Mm.
know, they often take mates for life. I'm not a parrot expert,
Yeah.
um, but there are many parallels that parrots might have with humans. And parrots often when they're taken as pets, will often be by sometimes people who don't know a great deal about parrots. They'll
Mhm.
develop a close attachment or relationship. And when those human partners leave for work or study, or they leave the home, and those parrots, if they have unstimulating environments
Mhm.
or they become bored, they tend to ruminate and sometimes they pluck their feathers, right? Anyway, my point though is that we had seen a lot of young people coming through the Headspace therapeutic programs in the early days, presenting with self-harming behaviors.
Mm.
And rather than, talking to a young person one-on-one only, and sometimes we did have those conversations where it
Yeah.
was necessary, but rather than only talking to that young person one-on-one about why they're self-harming or what's happening for them with their self-harming behavior, we thought it would be really interesting to teach young people how to support parents
Mm.
who were self-harming. And so
Wow.
we taught the young people about parrots and parrot behavior and why parrots might be self harming and plucking their feathers, but also how we would support parrots who were self harming by creating more enriched and stimulating environments. This is an example of taking something from inside and putting them out, externalizing.
Wow.
There is, in my view, there is never necessarily, there's very rarely a right or wrong way of doing it. But in my approach to things, I think that there is a collaborative way of coming to an interesting or creative approach to responding to a very serious problem. Self
Absolutely.
harm is among the very serious of problems that might confront a young person, including suicidal ideation. And you talk about body image, body, so how we perceive our bodies, perhaps also eating disorders and maybe other areas are all very, very serious problems. But how do we talk about these subjects collaboratively in a
Mm.
way that is safe for the person that we're supporting? And sometimes if we go into that session and, in some ways, and I can't think of a better word, but if I say interrogate that person
Mm.
on their behavior, it becomes very confronting and very uncomfortable for that person. But if
Absolutely.
we come in and collaboratively talk
Mm.
about an experience, perhaps we talk about, we give that experience a name.
Yeah.
It becomes, and that name might be decided upon by the young person and by you collaboratively in that moment, a monster of sorts. You think of this beast or
Mm.
this experience, this phenomena. I mean, Pixar did this really well with the Inside Out movies
Yes.
with Amy Poehler, and they've just released a new movie, a new version of it last year, late last year, I think, or this year,
Yeah. Last year.
and yeah, and they give a character to anger, so
Mm.
it's no longer your anger, John's anger, Sally's anger. It's now anger.
Yeah.
It's an entity that you can play with. You can give it a personality. You can tell it off. Monster, we don't want you here. You're unhelpful to us right now. Right? It
Absolutely.
gives us a way of communicating more effectively with that part, you know?
Yeah, and would you say like it's more like you're not personalizing it, so it's something outside and you can deal with it better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. This just it's just a thing that stuck in my head. We went to Target the other day and my son saw those characters
Oh, yeah.
and he went, "Oh, mom, there's anxiety."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Yeah, mom, there's anxiety. Can I have anxiety?" I said, "Okay, you can have the toy." But yeah, it was very interesting how he can at this
Oh, yeah.
7-year-old age can actually relate to it. Um, there's something which I learned back home called metaphor therapy,
Mm-hmm.
which is on similar lines what you're saying, using metaphors in terms of we would, for example, same thing like, how is, like, for example, there was this kid who came in, this young person, and then we, tried to use metaphors, how to describe her anxiety. And then I said, just draw whatever it comes to your mind. And she drew a sesame kind of a monster.
Yeah.
And I said, great, so this is it. And then we started calling it, the Sesame character, just the Sesame monster. So
Mm.
whenever she would come, it will always be like, it's not how you're feeling or how anxious you are. And she also would connect to it better and just say that, oh, the Sesame has not been coming so often, or the blue one is not there, the red one's there, because then we try to change it into, okay, let's make it, better looking or better appealing. How can we change your anxiety into something not that scary?
Mhm.
And then that's helped. So would that be something they're talking about? Basically using metaphors to help.
Well, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, in a way,
in a
because I
way.
think that there are, you know, I inherently believe that humans are driven by stories,
Mm,
that stories of all kinds have been an innate part of human beings. The experience of being human, whether we're talking about um, cave paintings and stories depicted on cave walls, or we're talking about campfire stories, all the way through to reading books and watching Netflix. I think that we think and we communicate. We
connect
learn from
stories.
stories, right?
Yeah.
In Australia, of course, we have one of the oldest living cultures, the Aboriginal community,
Yeah.
who have historically used dreaming as a way of teaching and learning about the world and passing on that learning to generations. Um, and so I think that in anything that kind of incorporates or accepts or interestingly uses stories as a part of learning within therapy, I think is useful. I mean, when you use your example around the monster,
Yeah.
the thing about monsters, if you consider it, it allows you to go much more deeply into that experience of anxiety. So let's say the anxiety is the monster.
Mm,
Well, why has the monster decided to come and preoccupy itself with you?
yeah.
What has motivated that monster to
Mm,
be here? And what makes it a monster? So, I mean, I think, if I reference Noam Chomsky's work in linguistics, there are many other uh, theorists who look at the use of language and words and its influence on our belief system and how we see the world, right? Words, we think in words, we often dream in kind of ideas, visual images or words. And so, if we then imagine that something is a monster,
mm,
well, then why do we think things are monsters? What gives that image? Often things that are unknown
yeah.
or different to us. If you think about monsters driven by the darkness, monsters under the bed for children, or monsters in the dark, or lots of mythology around monsters, even in Disney or many cultures around the world have different stories that kids, children talk about in terms of monsters. And it's often because these monsters seem large and overbearing and
Mm,
scary, frightening in some way. But can you then understand a monster? Is it possible?
mm,
And if it was a being like any other animal or human, then do they have motivations?
mm,
Do they have energy of their own? Do they have intentions, reasons? I mean, we don't have to exist in a two-dimensional character. Like if you watch many Disney films from, say, the 1990s, for example, Aladdin or Lion King or so on, you might notice that the villains of the film are often quite two-dimensional in the sense that they are depicted,
mm.
illustrated in an evil-looking way, right?
Correct.
But as we start to expand in terms of the Disney approach,
Yes.
we get newer films in the last, say, 5 years or so, like Cruella from the
Dalmatian.
Dalmatians movie. We also get other musicals, like which came out as a movie recently. What is it called? What is that movie that they sing? That was a theatrical production. Wicked, the Wicked
Wicked.
Witch.
Wicked, which, yeah.
Where you start to take a, a typically um, evil character
Mm, mm,
and you tell their story. They're commonly accepted as an evil character, but then we say, no, well, let's give it some dimensions here and say that maybe this person has gotten to this point in their life in a particular way. And then does the audience now see them as less villainous, less evil? Well, it's possible. And does that mean that we could also depict anxiety over time, collaboratively with our client, of course, as less frightening when we understand them more, when we shine some light on the monster, we
Mm.
support the monster. I mean, how many times do we see creatures in animated films initially perceived as frightening, but then you zoom into their paw and they've got something stuck in their paw and they're screaming out of pain, right?
Mm.
They're distressed, and you remove and support that being, and they now become so much nicer.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that that's what's so fascinating about working with monsters and creating a character, because
yeah,
then that character can start to take on a life of its own, but it can be admonished, it
yeah.
can be uh, it can be told off, it
Sure.
can also be understood, or at least attempted to be understood, if that kind of makes sense. I hope I'm
Yeah,
making sense,
yeah, yeah,
Aditi.
absolutely. Actually, it's very interesting, something that kind of is been I'm reflecting on as you're talking about stories and Disney's and how,
Mm,
like you said, culturally in all cultures, I think we do
yeah.
have so much history in terms of stories, right? From, grandma stories to fables to everything. I think
Mm,
we've grown up hearing stories, and every story in a way has a moral of the story and things like that. So it's interesting to say, like, what, T connection in terms of, I was just thinking the concept of making mental health normalize. It's always been there. I think it's just about going back to the basics and going and acknowledging what we've been taught while we were growing up. So I think my a question, or what I would like to hear your insight was in terms of, if if a person who is going through, just any age group, any layman who is not from the mental health field is listening to us, and in terms of how could stories benefit mental health, like how would a person actually reflect on stories to help them with their stress or their everyday anxiety.
Well, potentially in lots of ways. I mean, look. Obviously, I'm a psychologist, and I think that there are all kinds of reasons for why somebody might present to see us. And I want to recognize that there is a multidisciplinary team that exists, focusing on a whole range of different areas, whether that be psychiatry or whether that be occupational therapy, nursing, or so on. I absolutely think, though, that a contributing factor could be, as you put it, storytelling. And I think that there is a few reasons for that. One is that the storytelling is is written, it's authored, and it can shift and change and evolve in all kinds of ways. And it can be co-written by members of the family, as well as the individual who is going through their story as well. And until one person dies, and even then that's arguable, I think that the story could continue to be written.
Mm,
So it hasn't ended. It isn't a contained 2 hour movie, for instance. It's an ongoing and evolving story. I also think that the beauty there is that with perspective over time, that stories become something more.
mm,
They're able to take pathways that perhaps we were not expecting. I mean, how many times do you watch even a Netflix series or any streaming series and find the twists and turns along the way completely unpredictable? You start
yes.
off thinking that these are good characters, and then they turn out to be evil or bad characters, or maybe they're really just complicated characters. And so the other thing is, if you consider as a metaphor, you know, if you consider watching a series or reading a book, they often talk about certain characters in the background, or you see them. They're known as extras, right?
Mm,
But
mm,
we don't know what their story is unless you tell it. And so then there is a notion that there's not just one story. There are
mm,
many stories that are happening at the same time, and that doesn't invalidate any one story, but rather says that there is many to consider. And so, for instance, many people, I had a colleague, I have a colleague who's in their 80s, a psychiatrist, who often says to me that it's very rare for him to come across an individual who comes to see him for mental health reasons that has not experienced something bad happening to them. That more often than not, although not always, a person with a mental health problem will often have experienced or endured some kind of impactful adverse circumstance, some kind of experience that has really not gone their way.
mm,
And in that sense, how can you invalidate that person's experience in any way by saying that you should look up or things should be positive? I don't think it's as simple as that. I
Mm,
think we accept and validate that that is a horrible experience for that person at least. But then also let them know that, and maybe this is inviting that person to consider whether there might be other stories at play. Is
mm,
there other stories possible here? You know, when you think, for instance, it's not binary in the sense of, well, a story is either good or bad. I mean, there is a therapist named Martin Seligman who did a lot of work in his early career with learned helplessness.
mm,
And then he started to become, over his career, the father of positive psychology,
mm,
looking at learned optimism and flourishing. We also have these concepts of post-traumatic growth as opposed to
mm,
post-traumatic distress disorder,
mm,
post-traumatic stress disorder. The concept, of course, is that whilst a traumatizing event might adversely impact an individual, of course, it might impact a person so significantly that it causes an illness like
mm,
PTSD. It can also result in great growth.
mm,
And so we know, for instance, and I know this process from a local Aboriginal person, Caracan, well, at least I think it is. Caracan is an Aboriginal name that kind of refers to this notion of a seedling or a seed pod
mm,
that lays dormant under the ground and requires a bushfire in order to crack open the exterior so that the plant inside can grow.
yeah.
And this is not too dissimilar to other notions of the phoenix or of rebirth more broadly, that usually you need some kind of destructive force for there to be growth and evolution. In
Mm,
fact, wouldn't most people argue that a book or a TV show or a movie where nothing really happens to the main characters will
mm,
probably not be very interesting because
mm,
we don't see very much growth from the characters themselves. And so in that sense, when you ask me how could stories contribute in some way, how could telling stories contribute? Well, there is this notion that there isn't just one story at play, and we
mm,
could be creative in the course of our work together in co-authoring all kinds of pathways or stories, experimenting with different options, different experiences, different ways of seeing the world, of thinking about things, and not any one of them is more right than the other. They're all potentially right pathways, for that person to experiment with, right? And that more than one truth or more than one story can exist at any one time. It doesn't exclude any. So the last example, and I'll pause for a second, Danny, but like if you and I were to go to a movie together,
mm.
we would have watched the movie at exactly the same time, same characters. Is it possible that we would leave the theater and you might hate the movie and I might love it, or vice versa? Now,
Absolutely.
of course, if you are genuine and I'm genuine about our experience of the movie, we're not misrepresenting our experience, then how can we accept that it isn't truthful? It isn't possible that you can have a very pleasant and impressed experience, and I can have a very negative experience based on my lived experience, the way that I see the world, right? And vice versa. So if that's true in a movie, that's true in a book, and we know this, you can watch Rotten Tomatoes reviews and you can see that there are people who go 1 out of 10, and then people say 10 out of 10 and everything in between, right? Well, then we must accept that there are lots of different versions or stories or interpretations or experiences that people can have. And I think it's inviting somebody to consider what those options are that is different from other approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy in its purest sense. Because
Yeah.
it's not asking somebody to say, let's remove this maladaptive or unhelpful thought alone. It's
Mm,
saying, well, let's accept that that truth might be true, at least for you at this point in time, that there might be other truths here too.
absolutely. And would you say, thank you for that. I think that was
Sure.
a brilliant understanding. I think just listening about it, I can feel, as humans, I think we all have experienced this and we've seen our clients experience this. Any adversity that comes our way, the first reaction is, why me?
Mhm.
Like, why is this happening to me? I think that's always the first default setting of most of us. And then, of course,
Yeah.
because I think we also live in that kind of a delusional thinking where we feel that it's happening to others, it won't happen to us.
Mhm.
I think we've experienced it very recently with COVID, where I think everybody was like, it'll not happen to me, like, oh, it's not coming to Australia, and things like that. So I think
Mhm.
that approach, I feel like when you get the concept of stories to heal that approach, I think I just Because it's not about multiple stories of multiple people, isn't it about multiple stories of the same
Oh
individual?
yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, you in this storytelling, you take on perspective, you take on different nuanced understandings. I mean, isn't it true that a director of a film can create many different versions or many different endings or very, many different options for their characters, right? And maybe they experiment with which one lands with the audience more than others. And so I think that, you know, and if I use the example of an earthquake, I know you're recording this, so perhaps this is this this is something that might be sensitive, but let's see how
That's okay.
let's experiment with how we go. I mean,
Yeah.
if you have a natural disaster like an earthquake or a volcano, right? And there are human settlements immediately around the epicenter of that. Of course, you would say, okay, that's a pretty significant tragedy, especially if it hurts or takes lives, destroys property, livelihoods, businesses, homes, and so on. Of course, that's a negative experience. But then you also then zoom back a bit, and depending on how far you zoom out or zoom in, you think, well, the earthquake didn't necessarily have any intentions to harm people. It was doing what it was naturally designed to do, and perhaps brought on by geological, tectonic plates, rubbing together or something. And you see that over time, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and so on have often been responsible for creating new land masses, for creating new habitats for species to evolve and grow in. And so you might say, well, over the course of, say, thousands, millions of years, those actions might have been very positive with positive outcomes. But then when you zoom in, of course, you see the tragic and violent circumstances of the erupting lava or the earthquake shattering or breaking apart the earth. Now, which is true? They're both true.
Yeah.
All of them are true. And so I think that, and I learned this when I was at Canteen, and there were young people both impacted by cancer themselves, or they had a first degree relative with cancer, somebody in their lives with cancer, sometimes often maybe they were facing death directly.
Mm.
Is it possible to see both the tragedy and unfairness of a
Mm.
young person experiencing a cancer impact? But is it also possible to see anything else? Is that there is an invitation there, right? To the family, to that young person, to potentially consider that there might be other truths here. Now, that's not something that I create myself. I think it would be unfair, even disrespectful for me to suggest the story
Mm.
on behalf of a person. Whereas I think that as a maybe a participating author, a writer in the writer's room, if you like, I think I can provide some level of facilitated guidance by prompting, by being curious. What about this? What do you think about that? Is it possible? And all of that is done with respect, not in an invalidating sense, which is what I love about this approach. Of course, this approach can be used in conjunction with other therapeutic approaches like
Yeah.
cognitive behavioral therapy and others. It's not an exclusive therapy, you know? And
Yeah.
so, in that sense, I think that it is innately human. Did I answer your
Absolutely.
question? Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%. So there was a glitch, I think. Also. No, absolutely. I think, like I said, like you said, it's we are a story in ourselves, and we are
Yeah.
creating stories. And when you say that, yes, we can use those prompts to help people change that story or alter that story, would you also say that we all can help reshape each other's stories as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there, yeah.
Connection in general, like the existence of humans together, like just the friends and family and whoever we meet, also whom we meet in our practice, whom we meet and whom we influence is a strong word, but whom we basically we do change each other's stories as well, isn't it?
Well, I think that those stories become richer,
Mm,
they become more involved.
yeah.
I mean, of course, it has to be true.
Yeah.
Like you consider, um, you know, with any new introduction of a person in your life, you have another co-author
Mm,
of their lives and of yours. And you both are then now writing new stories and new histories based on when you come into contact with each other. And so, of course, those lives become richer, sometimes more complex and complicated, right? But I mean, we don't have to put a judgment on it as to whether it's good or bad, but I think it certainly becomes more interesting, right? More multi-layered. And I think that with new learning, I mean, the thing is, right, like if we be very reductionistic for a second, if you take, for instance, depression or anxiety, right? Then and you're suffering with it. You experience it in your own way, and it's debilitating. It's horrible. You wake up and you can't get out of bed, right? You think for a minute, is it possible that of the billions of people on our planet, is it possible that other people might have experienced this thing or something similar to it as well? Is it also possible that perhaps in the millions of years that this planet Earth has existed, and that includes all of the billions of people who are no longer on this planet, is it possible that they have also encountered experiences that are similar to yours? So, not only does that mean that you're not necessarily isolated or alone in your experience of anxiety or depression or whatever that might be, but you also have the capacity to tap into the knowledge base, the experiences, and the possible solutions that people have discovered and unearthed over millions, hundreds, thousands, whatever you want to look at it, years, right? I mean, even right now, looking at today, is it possible that there is somebody on the other side of the world that has a website or a blog or discussion forum that has a story to tell about their experience combating the monster of anxiety? And is it possible that that might inspire something of your own?
Yeah.
Isn't this how we become inspired from the arts, music, theater, television, books, as even right now, we see an idea and we go, gosh, that's an interesting idea, and we extend it and we talk about it further. You know what I mean? And so I think that there is recovery in itself in that space where we're often consulting with each other. Sometimes it might be less helpful or unhelpful even,
Mm, mm,
but
mm.
often it can also be very, very helpful. I think, and I'll pause on this point as well, Aditi, but I often think that this profession, the professionalization of psychology or psychiatry, mental health, kind of suggests that there is an elitist or a structure that exists that removes other people from participating in um, in in the recovery from a mental illness, a mental health problem. And I don't think that. I mean, our profession is relatively new in the scheme of things.
Oh, 100%.
But anxiety, depression, other mental health conditions, they might have been called something different, but they've all kind of been around for at least hundreds, possibly even thousands of years. There is some archaeological evidence that suggests this. And so, in that sense, people have been attempting to manage and alleviate those symptoms or those experiences for many, many years. I suspect sometimes very successfully and other times less so. And so I wonder what these people were doing that seemed to work. And often it was about a community that those
Mm,
people were a part of, um, the wisdom and the advice of people who were in their communities who might have experienced similar things, who might have made some suggestions, again, sometimes unhelpful or sometimes helpful.
mhm, yeah.
We have an advantage, though, now that we have also, in addition to
The
that, we
community.
also have people who've studied this space,
Mm,
who can contribute to this space with a scientific perspective. And I think that now more than ever, we have a really interesting opportunity to bring these historically ancient, lifelong, long term ideas about recovery, mental health, even personal discoveries and experiences that people are encountering right now. And we can bring that together with professional people who've studied this,
solid.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's an interesting opportunity there, right?
Absolutely. I loved what you said. And like that's so true. Like that, it just reminds me of, so my brother, is a writer. And this was one of his very senior writers he said something to him once, which kind of stuck to me when he narrated it to me. This is a very senior writer. And he said to my brother that, whatever you're writing, whatever you're writing has already been written. He said there is nothing like a new idea. Like you said, there's somebody in some part of the world or somewhere or years ago, it's already been written. It's like we are rewriting a lot of things, or we are looking at things differently, maybe, but as an idea, when we say, sometimes when you go, "Oh, I want to be somebody who has the original idea." And he just said this in a very interesting way. He said, "Oh, there is no original idea. For you, it might be original because you haven't heard it. But
Mm.
there must be somebody out there." So it's all about stories, like storytelling, like you said, archaeologically. Um, the moment life exists, mental and physical challenges, I'm sure, existed. It's just the world evolved differently. The struggles were different back then, it's different back now. I'm mindful of the crunch of time. Just one quick question,
Oh.
in terms of stories again. Of course, I think
Mm.
I'm going to do we have to one more or two more podcasts taking on more topics in terms of the teenagers and adolescents. But now that we've gone into the storyline, and I'm loving how it's taking shape, and I think people are going to really enjoy listening to how we can, view our life as a story, but not personalize it. Just one quick question in terms of resistance. When I even think, I'm sure again we've seen this in our space. We've experienced this as individuals. Some people just do not want to change their stories, or do not want to, or take time to change. There's that resistance that comes into play. How would you, again, what's your take on it? What's the narrative therapy or the storytelling understanding of how
Mm.
do we encourage people to actually change their stories or alter their stories?
Yeah. I mean, I I think it's an interesting word, the notion of change or alter, right? And that in itself, I think, can sometimes be invalidating for somebody who has held on to their truth for such a long period of time.
Absolutely, yes.
And so I think that the prospect of having to change something can be really quite daunting for lots of people. In fact, it can be really quite unappealing altogether.
Absolutely.
Also, when you think of the notion of resistance,
Mm,
or protest,
mm,
I think of the millions of people who protest or resist things all the time. You think, oh, we've just had an election here in Australia, a national election, and you think about at various points in the election how many people protest or resist
yeah.
the authorities in charge, right? And why do they do that? It's often because they feel as though they are unheard,
Mm,
or they are unseen, or that the government isn't doing right by them. They feel wronged, perhaps, by them. And so then what do? Well, some people decide to resist, to protest strongly, hold up banners, yell out, yell louder, right? Whether it be about mental health or climate change or anything. We hear it all the time in elections. We
absolutely.
hear it a lot even between elections. And
Absolutely.
I think, it's why many cultures around the world, many countries say that it is a right to protest peacefully, to be
Mm,
able to have your voice heard. So is it possible that when clients, as as you put it, interpret the notion or have a sense that we are wanting to control or change them, like the government might change them or be unheard or not seen by us as therapists, then of course many would want to resist, I think. Many would want to protest that because it is not our story to write. Similarly, many people who protest say, how dare a government make decisions about
mm,
their life or their children's future lives on their behalf when they believe that their decisions are not appropriate, not
mm,
safe. I mean, we talk about any issue, for example, and I don't want to take a political position necessarily, but if you take any climate or environmental activism,
yeah.
and many parents or families now are thinking, well, in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, when they're kids who are maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years now, right?
Mm,
Well, in the future, is it right that a government that has 3 years' job makes a decision that might affect your children in 20 years' time, 30 years' time? How do we resist that?
mm.
is it right that they are able to own their decision? Now, the reason I say all this is because of the same thing that occurs, the same feeling, I think, or a very similar feeling that occurs in a therapeutic context.
Mm,
If we come in there as an expert, we're in charge, we're
mm,
in government, you know,
mm,
you've
mm,
come to me and I'm going to fix you or
mm,
solve your problem because I know more than you, or
mm,
something like this,
mm, mm,
then is it possible that that person might feel that maybe we don't know them very well?
mm.
We're not working
Yeah,
collaboratively together,
yeah, yeah,
that we're not in it. So I often think about this notion of evolution or change or a growth over time. And that never, um, it very rarely, I should say never, I shouldn't say never, it very rarely means the discarding of an individual's truth or experience. It's always added to. And
yeah.
so that
Sorry to
experience,
cut you,
yeah,
Daniel. I think
sure.
what I meant was not just in the therapeutic context. For example,
Mm,
as human beings, you know, like for example, just a layman, in personally, you know that I have to alter some of my,
mhm,
beliefs or lifestyles or whatever is happening is not helping me personally. For example, if I am the person who wants to change, I've understood that,
mhm,
but still, I don't want to give up my story. Like I know I need to, but I don't want to give up.
mhm.
So how can we change? How can that person, like, how can I change that? Or what is it that might help me change that perspective? Does that make sense? So not more,
Maybe, yeah.
yeah, in just as a person, for example, we are all, this is a TikTok
Yeah.
generation or a
Okay.
Insta generation. So we are scrolling and we're looking at some of these reels and go, yeah, I should work on mindfulness. I should do blah, blah, blah. But then when it comes to action, nah, I don't want to do this. Like because we are so
Yeah.
comforted in that toxicity sometimes, or just whatever we are going through. Like we know it, but we don't want to change the story. So how can we make that shift happen is what I'm asking
Well,
just as a.
yeah. I mean, perhaps I want to reference again the theories around motivation,
Mm,
particularly
mm,
Rolnick and Miller's motivational interviewing styles, which come
mm,
from maybe Desai and Ryan's ideas of self-determination theory. You know, we have to, in order to sustain behavior change, there has to
mm.
be a combination of intrinsic or internally generated reasons
Motivation,
and
yeah.
external rewards. And I think that often it's the case that we can rationally understand that there is some reasons for shifting our behavior, but
Mm,
often we don't necessarily understand or are driven by the internal. The interesting thing for me, Aditi, is that it's entirely. I would say that there are certain things in the world that would motivate an individual to engage in behavior change,
mm,
and if those things um, are accepted or meaningful or valued by that person. So, for instance, if it relates to the care of your family,
mm,
or if it relates to something that is so critically important to you in your life, then most people would find some way of moving forward, doing that, or engaging in that. And there is a story there. Or what is
mm,
the story behind this?
mm,
Whereas I think that if people are, how many times do people say, oh, I want to join the gym? Where I want to get fitter or change my body size in some way or eat better or
mm,
maybe do a different job or go on holidays. I mean, these are kind of ideas that come up very regularly for us. You touch on a really interesting idea as well earlier where you talk about familiarity.
mm,
I
mm,
think that human beings are also instinctively driven towards the familiar, the routine, the predictable. That
mm,
whilst we have ideals for something more, something better, ultimately what's around the corner is unseen and as a result more scary and more unpredictable. And so we often stay in the familiar, the predictable territory, often hoping or desiring for something new or something more, but ultimately knowing that there is anxiety attached to any change. And so part of this is, well, what are the stories that we attach to change? What are the stories that we attach to the reasons for why we want to do anything we want to do? I mean, people say, well, I want to get fitter. Okay, why?
mm,
What's your story there? Well, you
mm,
say most people are able to recount or comment on stories that relate to perhaps what they've heard, as you say, on TikTok or on
mm,
Instagram, or they might talk about what their partner or family members have suggested to them. They want to appease other people in their life. But it's often the case that sometimes those people don't have fully developed stories, reasons, or ideas for why they actually want to pursue this substantial change in their routine, their familiar existence, their experience. Why would you go to such an effort? And that I think is key. And so,
Mm,
if I were working with somebody who knew that they wanted to change, or at least part of them wanted to evolve or do something, grow in a particular area, then I would be wanting to ask them, a bit like Miller and Rolnick in motivational interviewing. You know, I'd almost want them to try and convince me, why is this important to you? How
mm,
did this come about for you?
mm,
What's the story there? How did you come to really be interested in going down this pathway? What is in it for you? I mean, how many people in the past would be smoking cigarettes and therapists would come along well intentioned and say, John, just quit smoking. It'll give you more money or it'll be better for your health. And that guy's been smoking for 10 years. And he's like, well, I don't notice any difference right now in my health. And I've not had any problems financially. So the reasons you suggest aren't really for me. So I'll
mm.
just continue smoking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's important what that person sees as the reason. So, John, tell me why you want to quit smoking. Will you tell me why? What's the reason for you?
Awesome. Love it. Love the fact. What's your story? Because that is so true. Because this is happening so much around us. The whole Instagram, YouTube, shorts, the
Mm,
influence from the influencers and
mm,
everything is catching up on people, and people get into, of course, we'll get into it next time more, but it happens, you get into that virtual reality so much, and then you feel down and sad, and then you don't know why you're feeling it. I think I would just say the snapping question would be, wait. Is this your story? No. What's your story? I think that would be the catch line or the tagline for today. Like, this is somebody else's story and it not be your story. And that's
yeah.
so important to understand, because I think everybody is trying to make their story based on what they see other people's story is. But we both have completely different stories to live, and we have lived. So I think, and to create. So thank you so much, Daniel. I think this was fantastic. Of course, I'm sure this is a teardrop of the knowledge that you have, and we will keep coming back and exploring more of the expertise you have. But just to sum it up, any last quick um, points or views from your end, something that we could hold on to, um,
Oh,
anything
that,
maybe that to just wrap it up.
well, I mean, I think that always puts me in a lot of pressure to come up with something that wraps everything up. But I suppose you know the thing about stories, right, Aditi, is that nobody has ownership over them. In the sense of like you and I have to do a license to practice as a psychologist, right?
Yeah,
That we have to go through a number of years of study and training, and then we have to do registration programs and even an exam and all kinds of things.
all of that.
And
Yeah.
so there's almost like an entry to gain access to specialized knowledge.
Mm,
But the thing I love about the use of stories in a therapeutic sense is that nobody owns that. It has been innately human for hundreds of thousands of years. And I think that we can learn from stories, we can feel from stories, we can connect over stories. And I think in that sense, it's really great that our first conversation recorded in this way is ultimately about stories, because it is almost an equal opportunity, if you like, access point for people. That people forget that when there are mental health crises or problems, that sometimes people are you know they want to look for medication options or a lot of formal therapeutic treatment options, and I think that can be very important. But equally, I also think it's important that people remember that they can also connect with people in their lives, people around them, people in their community. And when we talk about stories, it's not just telling a story with a
yes.
narrative arc, it means connecting with somebody, having a conversation. So maybe that's, I mean, in not wanting to go over for another 10, 15 minutes, maybe that'll be my takeaway,
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Thank
eh?
you for your time. I think we will definitely very soon connect again and get more expert opinions from you. Thank
All
you
right.
so much for everything.
Thanks for having me.
I am
Thanks, Aditi.
Thank you. I'm just going to